So we're going to start hearing about space biomanufacturing in low Earth orbit. The panel is moderated by Joe Bozada of Interphase Materials. On the panel are Aaron Rogers, Senior Scientist at RedWire, Jana Stoudemire, Commercial Innovation Strategy Lead at Axiom Space, Nicole Wagner from LambdaVision, Prashant Kumta, Professor at the University of Pittsburgh and the McGowan Institute, and lastly, Bill Wagner, Director of the McGowan Institute. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning. First, I want to thank the collaboration for hosting this event. And the little that I've been here, it just seems like an incredible event for us to share our point of views. Excuse me. So this isn't the first time I've been in front of this esteemed panel. I actually was a lead facilitator on a symposium we did last year, a year and a half ago. And we really were looking at how do we commercialize biomanufacturing in low Earth orbit. It was really interesting, not only working with some of the brightest people in the world, but there were 4 takeaways that I think are important to share. So the first one is we need to start looking differently about space. So the first thing we need to do is look at microgravity as a technology. So it needs to have some scientific application, applying scientific knowledge for practical purposes. The second thing that I took away from the symposium, as a nation, we really need to treat LEO, low Earth orbit, as an infrastructure, much like we do academic institutions, even communication networks, and as far as the highway. And what was really interesting when we looked at it, most of the investment in the infrastructure has been on the supply side. And what you're going to hear today is actually the opposite of people that are actually creating the demand to get up into space and do incredible things. And I just want to remind everyone here, when I talk infrastructure, there's a global competition around that. And, it's tough, but the winnings are enormous. The third thing that came out of that symposium that I took away, as we define the realm of the possibility and science tries to catch up, there's tremendous risk. And I think other speakers have talked about the panels. And these risks are too large for a single company to take on, and it's too commercial for government agencies to own. So there needs to be formal public-private partnerships, commitments to de-risk low Earth orbit. And finally, I think the most interesting takeaway, when we were looking at commercial value, what emerged out was data. So data will be the first thing that people will start buying. And when you think about data and its importance, it could lead to new drug discovery, accelerate clinical trials, give us a better understanding how diseases are impacted on our terrestrial environment. So along with the data, there needs to be a tremendous push towards artificial intelligence. So enough about those takeaways. I would introduce every panel member, but I'd be up here for another 15 minutes. They are giants amongst the areas they practice. So up here you have visionaries and influencers of biotechnology in low Earth orbit. You have some of the greatest scientists up here, so pick their brains. You have people that are willing to take risk and invest into our future. You also have insiders with tremendous insights of where we are and where we need to go. So we originally were going to have every member give a short presentation, and we huddled right before this and said, no, there's so much interest in some of the themes that we want to talk about that we'd rather go free form. We will make those presentations available. They're actually pretty cool. They show a lot of interesting things that these folks are doing up in space. So there's a couple of themes that I'm going to just ask and let them jump in. So the first one is sustained microgravity as a technology platform. What's the realm of the possibilities? What can you do in low Earth orbit that you can't do here on Earth?
Well, one thing about gravity, in terms of biology, when you're developing, as a fetus and everything, you're kind of in this like neutral buoyant state. You're kind of just floating around. Your cells are developing and differentiating, proliferating, and whatnot. That aspect we can reproduce with microgravity, and that kind of ties into a lot of research into 3D bioprinting. One of the benefits, where we can leverage microgravity is when we print something, it will stay where we put it. It won't settle out, so you don't get density gradients and other things like that. That is something that we can't reproduce on the Earth.
Yep. Hi, good morning. I'm Jana from Axiom Space. Very pleased to be here, and I think this is a great effort to bring everyone in the region together. I think it's a really good idea, and you have a lot of strength in this region. So on the microgravity front, when you talk about cells specifically, and this panel is devoted to biomanufacturing, but obviously a lot of work goes on in advanced materials as well, and there's lots of great phenomena there too. But from a bio perspective, there's several projects that we're looking at stem cell proliferation and tissue engineering. Obviously, things like creating vasculature in thick tissues is very important. Microgravity has some benefits there. We have some teams that have shown, through work that has been done through NASA's Vascular Tissue Challenge, that there's opportunities to look in microgravity to even help us think about how we can create thick tissues. Stem cells, obviously, a variety of different types of stem cell work have gone on. The ways cells signal to one another, the changes in gene expression that you see, even the way that cell and matrix interactions happen. It's very different in microgravity. And I often say, when I moved over to the space side of things, because I have a long history in pharma, biotech, and medical device, that it's a different way to think about science. And when you start to think about science in a way that you have opportunities to maybe have cells grow faster or address some of the manufacturing issues that we see here on the ground, it's potentially an opportunity for us to really change the way the industry looks at some of the current challenges that hold us back from that whole field of regenerative medicine really taking its true commercial potential.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Nicole Wagner. I'm the CEO of a University of Connecticut spin-off company called LambdaVision. And so what our technology, or what our company is doing, is we're developing a protein-based artificial retina to restore vision to millions of patients that are blinded by end-stage retinal degenerative diseases. So there's macular degeneration, which most of you are probably familiar with. We are going to start by targeting retinitis pigmentosa, which is an orphan disease, so a much smaller clinical trial patient population, to enter that market. And so a lot of the questions I get asked is, what are you doing in space? Why microgravity? And I joked a little bit with Cindy Buteau earlier. I met her at Mass Challenge in 2016, and so that's how I got my start in the microgravity space. So in 2016, I was literally sitting at a table like this. Somebody came and knocked on the table, and they said, hey, there's a panel down the hall. Why don't you go check it out? KSC is there, Boeing is there, and they're going to be talking about some of the work that they're doing in microgravity. And I said, all right, well, I didn't really have much to do that day. So I went to the panel, and I learned about the great work that is going on the International Space Station. And a lot of the things that Aaron and Jana have talked about. And so how does that relate to what we're doing? So as a company, we are developing these thin films through a process called layer-by-layer electrostatic deposition. It's a fancy word for basically saying we have a substrate that we coat with protein, and we do it multiple times. And so that process on Earth or terrestrially is very much subject to the effects of gravity. So things like gradients of solution, things like evaporation, convection, how we get that substrate to lay on the surface of that solution, all impacts the integrity of those thin films. So in a microgravity environment, we remove all of that, and the theory is that we are going to get a much better, more stable thin film. We've flown now to the ISS 4 times. We flew on SpaceX 16 at the end of 2018, NG 14, NG 15, and then we just came back on SpaceX 24 And we will be flying on Crew 4 mission, which is upcoming as well. So I had a little show and tell, which is basically we have this tiny little vial of protein, which we coat on a scaffold, and that is what creates this artificial retina. And so you can see it's very, very tiny. So you can see how that can easily be carried out in a microgravity environment. And so I know we have a couple other questions coming up, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about this.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Prashant Kumta, and from University of Pittsburgh and McGowan Institute. I work in the, I'm a material scientist by training, and I got involved in tissue engineering, as a biomaterials perspective. And I also work in the energy space, so people think that I'm crazy trying to do bio and energy. There's no connection, but the materials is what connects the two. So in the biomaterial space, when you talk about biomaterials, clearly processing, and making the biomaterial is a key. And there are so many challenges that we face in trying to make materials for tissue engineering on Earth itself. And several years ago, almost 12 years ago, we got involved in making resorbable metals, and that was a new idea then, and still is, since polymers are typically considered as resorbable flagship materials. So we worked with magnesium. Bill Wagner here, was the one who came up with that idea, and we started working on it. And as you know, magnesium is, it's an old metal, yes, but it's a very reactive metal. And the first thing that comes up when we talk about magnesium is that it catches fire, it explodes. And when we were doing that work on Earth itself, we had a lot of trouble. We couldn't even make magnesium. It would just sort of disappear in the furnace, And the reactivity of magnesium is a big challenge, trying to make good quality magnesium, and we are in Pittsburgh, which is the steel city. So when you use conventional techniques for making magnesium, gravity plays a big role, and there's always heavy things that settle down at the bottom, the light things that go up, so there are a lot of defects that remain, porosity being a big one that comes in because of the gravitational effects. So 4 years ago, when I became introduced to the International Space Station and cases when they visited the University of Pittsburgh, that's how I got involved in microgravity. And I said, okay, this might be a cool thing. Clearly, lack of gravity could play a big role in the movement of the atoms and the ions which are involved in magnesium. So that's how I started working in this space. And clearly, when you look at microgravity, the lack of g-forces that play a big role in settling down of particles, movement of particles in the lateral direction, can have a significant effect on improving the quality of the metal. And especially creating a metal with good quality without the defects is very critical when you implant it in the body, because when you have a lot of defects, especially in a resorbable metal like magnesium, it creates a lot of hydrogen when it reacts with the body fluids, and hydrogen is it's a gas. So if it doesn't dissolve in the body and go away, it creates gas pockets. It interferes with the healing process because it makes it very basic, and it creates a condition for cells to die. So creating magnesium with good quality is what drove me into this area now. We have a project with cases that we are working on towards making it happen. So that's why microgravity, I think, is a cool thing, and I feel it has a lot of opportunities. So I guess I'll stop here and then come back.
So I'll come at it from the health angle. So the McGowan Institute emphasizes the development of technologies that address organ and tissue failure. And a key aspect of our mission is getting it to the patient. And getting it to the patient means that there's a business model. It means that you have the financial backing to get through the regulatory pathway, that you have the ability to go through the very high GMP manufacturing standards, that you can do the reimbursement pathway. It's just a very long, complicated model that is expensive. So there has to be a robust business model behind it. And as a result, we've focused on a couple of different technologies, pediatric devices being one, craniofacial technologies, military medical technologies. And in each case, it's a question of really examining the technology and the business model, intellectual property, et cetera. So what we recognized with our work with the space station is a lot of this was even repetitive discovery. Some of the projects you just heard here are moving beyond that. But ultimately, there needs to be a business model. And there has to be an understanding of the line of sight, if you will, to how you're going to get investors to come in and to support it. There can be risk, but you have to have some concept of that. So that led to this consortium and bringing thought leaders together and identifying what we thought were the most promising technologies so far.
So, Bill, could you continue with that theme of commercialization? What areas do you actually see as the highest potential healthcare medical devices coming from low Earth orbit back to the patient?
Yes, well, not me, but the symposium, the assembly of these thought leaders came up with 4 major areas. First one, you've heard stem cells. The secretome, in other words, what the stem cells produce that may impact other cells and tissues. That's probably number one. A lot of intellectual property out there waiting to be nailed down. The second one I would say is biomaterials/medical devices. So you heard from Nicole about the deposition onto surfaces, and you heard from Prashant about crystal formation. Those would be examples of biomaterial development. And then the 3D printing would also fit into that space, making constructs that you cannot reasonably make in a similar manner under gravity. Beyond that, I would say the combination of robotics and sensing, so to be able to do this in a highly parallel fashion without astronauts pipetting. I see astronauts pipetting, and I'm thinking to myself, that has to stop. I mean, it needs to be robotic, it needs to be reproducible, and it needs to be at a massively larger scale than what one person, even well-trained, can possibly do. And with that robotics implementation needs to come sensing and the development of these large data sets, which with artificial intelligence will allow the separation out of the key benefits of microgravity. So I think that's part of the key aspects of the future that came out of that symposium.
Any other panel members want to chime in on commercialization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Bill, you make a great point, right? Because the science is one part of what we can do in microgravity, but the opportunities to really think about fully commercializing and bringing technologies to patients is not a small ask, right? And especially when we talk about those GMP capabilities, moving that to a space station, the logistics of doing that is intense. I mean, we have a rocket that we're going to go up on. We're going to do work when we're on a station, and then we're going to come back down again. And currently, the ISS does not really lend itself to the most clean environment to be making products that would go into humans. So for the Axiom platform, one of the things that we're looking at is establishing those GMP capabilities. And it's not going to be different from the capabilities that FDA requires right now, but we are going to have to work with NASA very closely to develop that logistics chain to be able to say, when we put it on a rocket and when we send it up to the platform and we do the work there, we can show you that we're in control the entire way. And the same when the products come back down. And I think the other big piece of the commercialization, NASA support right now for commercial application development in low Earth orbit is fantastic. We just had a selection of 8 projects that are going through, many of them with biomedical stem cells, certainly 3D printing, all the things that Bill mentioned, medical devices, in addition to what Nicole described. There's injectable matrix and, lots of different opportunities for us. So I think as we show that proof of concept, we'll bring the other investors along with NASA to help us to really develop those markets in low Earth orbit.
Nicole, you're at the forefront of commercialization.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we spent a lot of this conference talking about deep space, robotics, moon, lunar missions, I think what is often missed is thinking and sort of challenging that thinking to what can be done in low Earth orbit, stimulating some of that demand. Like many of you in the audience, I've had a couple of those conversations where, you're thinking, how the heck do I get to space? How does a company think outside of that traditional line of thought? And, I had the same questions. I mean, when I went to that presentation at Mass Challenge, I was thinking, what am I doing here? This is Moon, this is Mars. How are they going to help me? And if you could have seen my face after the presentation, I'm like Googling Raspberry Pis and how am I going to connect to the ISS on my own? And there's no way that I'm going to get security to do that. This project is way too big. I'm never going to be able to fund it. What am I doing? And literally, we sat down and we had a team meeting, and those exact things came out. They're like, this is pretty crazy, Nicole. I was like, yeah, but there's funding for it. Let's try it. This could solve some of our problems. And, there are people out there. There's implementation partners. There's groups like Sierra. There's groups like Axiom that are really looking to develop this low Earth orbit economy. And I think, not every project is a perfect fit. We're talking about commercialization. I mean, some of it is thinking about the economic models, thinking about the price to get there. Is the product that you're making suitable? Is it better? How much can you charge for that product? So like, to Bill's point, to Jana's point, I mean, there has to be some, commercial model. You have to think about commercialization as well. But if it's a superior product, there's no reason not to do it on the International Space Station or on a commercial platform. And so, those are the types of questions that I have regularly, thinking a lot about the economics, thinking a lot about scalability, right? So right now I'm thinking, we're constrained by the parameters that we have to go to the ISS. And, as we have these new commercial space stations coming online, there's a lot of ways to think outside of that box. There's a lot of ways to be, breeding that ingenuity, thinking about creatively solving unique problems that cannot be solved on the ground or terrestrially. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And I certainly, beyond what we're doing for the artificial retina, I think there's other applications. I mean, anything for us that we can deposit a protein on any scaffold, right? We've thought about, ITO or some sort of a charged substrate. What would that look like? And could that enable other opportunities that weren't, a possibility before because of reproducibility and getting that nice homogeneous thin films? So I think, I'm excited to see what the future holds for LEO.
Prashant or Aaron?
Yeah, I think another thing that becomes important is for commercialization is the cost. I mean, people always talk about, well, if you're going to make it in space, the cost of taking it to space is huge. It's true, but when you look at the cost to benefit on Earth when you're trying to combat the problems that we face. I gave an example of magnesium, right? I mean, the typical way to make a metal, is to melt it, and then you cast it, and then you have to solidify it. And then when it's defective, you got to go through a process, several processes of what is known as extrusion, where you have to draw it through a die and squeeze it through to get rid of the porosity. All of these steps, cost a lot of time and effort and money. And we don't need to do that in space. I mean, it'll simplify the process tremendously, where you can just create the metal without the porosity, without the defects that are present. So you don't have to do any of those additional steps. So the cost versus benefit, I think, is huge. I mean, the benefit that can be by getting it in space would clearly outweigh the other costs that are there. So I think that's a great opportunity that can be. And the same with printing too. I mean, when you're talking about bioprinting, when you talk about stem cells, when you talk about creating a tissue, on Earth we have to use a lot of additives to combat the diffusion-related problems with gravity, to create the dispersants, to stabilize them. And many of these additives are not conducive to the cells. I mean, so we have to work around it to try to see how we can. In space, it gives you the opportunity to not use these additives, and you can create this, in a much more uniform and get the right kind of consistency that you want that cells will tolerate. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for creating good quality, what I call as transformative materials, which much more easily, and it would propel the field even better. And as a result, a lot of progress can be made. And so from the commercialization point of view, it's a great opportunity, to build completely a different platform from space-based economy.
Aaron?
Oh yeah, I think good job covering that as well. It is, everybody talks about cost to get to space. Like, oh, you're going to make something in space. It's going to cost so much to bring it down and to bring up supplies and all that kind of thing. But if microgravity is the only environment you can produce that product, the cost kind of becomes a little less of an issue if that's the only place it can be done. And in terms of bioprinting, like Kumta mentioned, you have to use, something to basically harden as you print. So some kind of cross-linking, basically additives that affect the cells in negative ways. So when you go up into microgravity, you're able to basically just put a cell where you want it with no additional additives. You don't even have to put ECM. You can just put matrix, basically. You can just put the cell wherever you want, and it stays there. And that's a lot more physiologically relevant than anything that can be done on the ground. And I think that definitely overcomes that initial hurdle in cost.
I just want to add one thing to this because, I always look for, when the argument about cost comes up, I think there's a couple of things that, first, people think about the rocket cost, right, which is going down, as you're hearing, and we are going to be living and working in low Earth orbit way before we're living and working on the moon, and things like first private astronaut missions that bring people to the ISS to start to show that we're going to do that, so that'll become more cost effective as well. But the idea of making something in microgravity is that you really cannot make it here on Earth. And it is transformative to an industry, whether it's additive manufacturing for biomanufacturing or for advanced materials that can be used for medical devices. And when you get into that category, actually those products become pretty priceless, right? Because they're not like anything that you can make here on Earth. And when you can provide that as a shift, a transformation in an industry like regenerative medicine or medical devices, I think that's when people are going to start to really take notice, right? And we're no different than the industry on the ground for biomedical, whether it's medical device, pharma, biotech. We can't do a clinical trial and show incremental benefit. We need to show tremendous benefit. And when we show that tremendous benefit, we only need one or two of those in space, just like what happens in biotech communities where everybody then wants to do the same thing. And so we're at that early stage where we're finding what these applications are, really trying to define that proof of concept. And once we show that, I think everyone will then have a much clearer understanding of what it means to manufacture in space and why we want to do it.
So this will be the last round, and then we'll open it up. Jana, I want to stick with you. What do you think the priority should be for the last 10 years of the International Space Station National Lab?
Absolutely. So we have a tremendous resource in the ISS that gives us an opportunity to look at that early stage proof of concept data that we really need to help us to move these applications forward. Technology demonstrations, early data that helps us to understand how we can move products towards commercialization. The nice part with the Axiom Station being attached in 2024 is we're actually going to have more space as well. So opportunities right now to utilize ISS and the capabilities that will come online even before it's decommissioned give us great opportunities to expand the lab space and to be able to continue to do this work so that by the time that we really have free-flying space stations, we have lots of applications that we're manufacturing, and that city in space, future city in space concept is really real.
Aaron, what about you? What do you think the priority should be as we wind that down?
I think Jana nailed it pretty much. I think, with these last years with the ISS, we need to explore pretty much all the possibilities that microgravity opens up for us so that when all these private, space stations get built, we can incorporate all the things that we learned in the final years at ISS into these new stations so that we can just, hit the ground running with real production.
I'll add to that. I mean, certainly it's a lot of applied R&D activities over the next 10 years, but these aren't siloed, right? I mean, an applied R&D project involves science. It involves tech development. it involves AI, it involves STEM education. So I would, as I think about it, I think it's not just what the product is or what the technology is, what the commercialization is. It's how many of these other players can you leverage to get the most value out of each one of these experiments? Because one of the things that all of the people on this panel are thinking about is those resources are scarce, right? I mean, we're thinking about crew time, cold stowage, glove boxes, how do you get to the ISS, up mass, down mass capabilities. All of those play a role into thinking through how, what is going to be done, what experiment will be carried out on the International Space Station. And I think the best way to think about it is who can you collaborate with? Why are we here? What does that consortium look like? It's not it doesn't need to be one experiment. It can be a multifaceted experiment with a lot of different pieces and knowledge being combined to be carried out. So in this room here, I mean, talk to your people at your table. Figure out how you can put together an experiment that has commercial potential, while educating a young student, get an intern involved, pair up with somebody at an academic institution to learn some valuable science from it, and leverage those limited resources as much as you can.
I would also like to add, I mean, Bill talked about the regulatory process, right? And so clearly, we have a lot of technologies here which are geared for fast track for FDA approval, and for a 510K, for example. And I would think those technologies that are being done on Earth, which are already slated for 510K, fast track FDA approval, those materials will be made even better in space and much more easily. So those should be the ones that I would say to be targeted. And clearly, there are a lot of potential people here with great ideas. So I think, as Nicole mentioned, get together, and I think we should put those technologies first.
Bring us home, Bill. What do you think the priority should be for the International Space Station?
I think I'd change I think the priority, not for the space station, but the priority is to build out the low Earth orbit platform. So why, going from the previous session, why is Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh? Well, to answer that question, I'm looking at the three rivers. Pittsburgh is here because of the rivers, because of its proximity to ore and transportation. It developed industrially, and money came in and built out this wonderful city that then attracted or generated enough wealth that educational institutions could be invested in and built up. And then that led to other good things happening. So the platform, the city and space needs to be built out. And whether that happens because of space tourism or because of military or whatever the mechanism by which it's built, the benefits of once it is built are profound. I went at the break over to the far window, and if you look to your left, you see the point at which Meriwether Lewis launched the famous Lewis and Clark Discovery mission. That mission was, to see what the Louisiana Purchase was worth. So it was that interface of discovery and industry. They weren't sent off just to discover a map. They were to document flora, fauna, resources, so that industry could follow and be built. And that's the point that we're at right now with low Earth orbit. What can we do up there that's going to generate benefit for mankind? And I think in healthcare, we're trying to figure that out right now. What are the compelling, frankly, it gets into the business. What's the compelling business model? Why is an industrialist going to put money in? So that, I think, is the more exciting thing, is how do we best facilitate the growth of this new city, this new frontier that is low Earth orbit?
Great. I'd like to open up for Q&A from the audience. So you're probably experienced what I did when I was facilitating the symposium, of just being amazed at the intelligence that is up here, trying to keep up with them, and then going home and Googling everything they said. So you understand it for the next session. So look across, I see the same expression that I had every week, every day. So don't feel bad. It's a great experience.
So thank you so much for, I think, yesterday we had all these bigwig politicians that, don't understand gravity because they think everything revolves around them. Today, we have the giants of the industry laying the foundation for the future. And what I love, both about the R&D panel before you and this, is that you guys are looking at R&D through the lens of a paying customer and the economy that is going to be built, as opposed to R&D for the sake of R&D and research for the sake of R&D. That is why this is going to be successful, and I commend the work that you're doing. You're blowing all of our minds here, and I know what you're doing, so it's just great to hear. And I just want to do a plug for the McGowan Institute, because when I met these guys in the work that we were doing at the Keystone Space Collaborative, their vision for building a consortium to create that city and to create the opportunities that will come by the folks that are sitting at the table today. The consortium is going to be in Pittsburgh because McGowan is in Pittsburgh. And so that is an automatic entree to this economy and to our region playing a role in it. And so I applaud the work that you guys are doing. I thank you for your sponsorship, but sponsorship is not as important as the thought leadership that you're bringing to the region on this, and to the nation, and to the international community. So I don't want to underscore the importance of this panel, because as Bill said, when you have something going into a human, you have a market.
Well, I'll have to apologize for talking all too much this weekend from out here. But I'd like Aaron Rodgers to take a moment to tell us about ZBLAN. It's probably one of the biggest things to hit as far as commercialization of space ever. It's huge, and I will leave it to you to tell us all about why.
Actually, I didn't actually catch that.
ZBLAN. So,
You're going to have to explain what that is.
yeah, so from a fiber perspective, the Made in Space group actually did the first ZBLAN work on orbit.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes.
So I have to specify that I'm actually a member, or was a member of TechShot, and now I'm RedWire. So I was not actually a part of any Made in Space projects. I see.
But I can tell you that ZBLAN optical fibers, lots of work. In fact, there was just on the Axiom 1 mission, they did photo lenses that were made on orbit with, polymer catalysts and same kinds of technologies that give you that purity of fibers. Now, what's really interesting about most people think of optical fiber for data communications. It's actually a very important medical device. It's what's used in all of the scopes that you see when you go into a, hospital for non-invasive surgery. So those products have crossover, whether it's an advanced material, just like when we were talking about the biomaterials that can be implanted into the body. So you could make hips, knees, shoulders, new medical devices. And all of the purity of those materials is what makes it so valuable from a microgravity perspective. I actually want to follow up, too, on one thing that you just said, because I think the importance of the McGowan Institute in this region is paramount. And obviously the work that goes on from a regenerative medicine standpoint. Across really all of microgravity, when you think of the pharma industry, pills, cell therapies, and now we're going to gene therapy, right? So you watch the trends in the industry, and you see that in each one of those areas, there's a benefit in microgravity. So even when you're talking about small molecule drugs, things like producing active pharmaceutical ingredients through a flow chemistry process on orbit, it's important. All the cell-based pieces that we talked about, and even some of the reprogramming and CRISPR-Cas9 kind of technologies, drug delivery, if you can make nanoparticles that are perfect for drug delivery. So there's a variety of applications for us to think about from a manufacturing standpoint. But I would also like to remind everyone, it's not just industry and academic institutions. you happen to have a perfect nonprofit here in the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, right here in Pittsburgh. And mitochondrial function in keeping astronauts healthy and people who live in those cities in space. I mean, that's a phenomenal connection to help us with how do we keep long-duration space travelers and those who want to live and work in cities in space healthy. So biomanufacturing, health, I think you have a lot in this region to draw from.
I just want to add one thing to that too. I mean, and this kind of aligns with a lot of the discussions that we've had, which have been around, what's the job training look like? I think you've heard us all talk a little bit in terms of low Earth orbit and the commercial opportunities that are there. It's not just engineers anymore. I mean, I'm hiring a lot of biologists, a lot of technicians. We're looking at, software there, in terms of even thinking through strategy. A lot of business development type of opportunities are available. So I would like to think, that space is not just, engineers anymore. And so you need to be training all of the academics in the room that are teaching students that, you can be in biology and get into a degree like this. You can start out as a chemist and you can design something totally different. You could do film. I talked to somebody about this as well. I mean, we have somebody looking at us that's an anthropologist that's studying our technology as if it were an artifact, right? So 500 years from now, what does an artificial retina look like? So there are a lot of opportunities to think outside of the box in terms of what really defines space and space research.
I think we have one more question. Yep.
So my name is Ava Boyd. I am with ANSYS, where I do government relations. So I have two parts question. The first one is more related to what I do. Are there any regulations or laws that will govern space biomanufacturing? And the other one is, how long does it take for an experiment that would happen in space? What's the preparation time for that? Thank you.
I can do the regulatory or take a shot. So the quick answer is no. No one's come up before the FDA yet. And I'm pretty confident the FDA would look at it, the way that they always do, which is identifying risks and then working to mitigate those risks and having, what's called a good manufacturing process, a good laboratory process where, everything's documented. And the nice thing about space is that's kind of standard operating protocol for, what goes on up there. But no, the FDA has not sat down. On degradable metals, they did sit down about 10 years ago and explored that. So.
And I'm going to add, on top of the FDA, so regulation, I guess if you would call it, and I always hesitate when I say this, but a lot of pharma goes offshore to manufacture because of the tax incentives. There's no tax structure in space yet. Just like when we had e-commerce, right? It took a while for that to catch up. So there's some advantages beyond if you don't have to build your own facility, 60,000 square foot manufacturing facility, suddenly you have access to that. Maybe there's tax incentives to be able to manufacture in space. We're looking at all of those opportunities to create this new market, in addition to bringing up state-of-the-art capabilities. And when Nicole mentioned about scientists, we need the scientists to come to the space side. We don't want aerospace scientists, we want scientists who know biology and who understand how to manufacture here on the ground that can help us to put the best tools on the new platforms that are being developed and give us the opportunity to really do that manufacturing in space. So there's lots of different aspects of it.
Then with time, I mean, for us, we started in 2016. We flew the first time in 2018. Typically is about an 18-month life cycle. Once you've done it and you kind of get the hang of it, you know what you're thinking through. We can iterate a lot faster now. We've flown 3 times in the past year. We'll fly again probably 3 times this year. And you stagger. You can stagger experiments and do things in parallel so that you're not waiting for something to come back. I mean, that's a lot of things that we talk about. But in general, I would say it's a 18 months timeline.
I think we'll be out of time after this question.
Yeah, so my question's for Nicole. For the artificial retina that you were talking about, is there any type of special landing requirement for that? I imagine that's really fragile component. Can you do a typical hard land?
Right now, yes. We don't have any issues in terms of landing. We are thinking about issues in terms of frequency of flights, the up mass and down mass capabilities, how frequently they fly. You can imagine if we send something up and we set a shelf life according to some of the things that Bill's been talking about, good manufacturing practices, or, what is a stability timeline? If we're expecting to come back in 3 months and we come back in 4 months because things get pushed, that could be an issue. But in general, in terms of the actual landing, we haven't had any issues there.
I just want to add on something. That's actually something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration, especially when talking about 3D bioprinting or artificial tissues or anything like that. If you're trying to send back a liver, you don't really want it to be a pancake when it gets back down. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think the whole concept of orbital transport vehicles, like, I know it seems far-fetched, even when you talk about a city in space, but we need FedEx, right? We need things to come back quicker than what the route is now, because, and the NASA chain is fantastic for long-duration exploration, keeping astronauts healthy. It wasn't built for commercialization. So we need to change that thinking, and it's not always just on a commercial resupply or a crew resupply. We need to have missions that actually correspond with manufacturing schedules and bring things back and forth the way that we need them to be there. So you're going to see a city take shape with all the pieces that are here terrestrially. They're just happening 250 miles up.
Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.